Good afternoon. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone else. I also should start just by thanking everyone in the Malpai Borderlands group. They're the ones who did all this work. All I had to do was document it and write it up. And I have been working with the Malpai group for more than 10 years now. And I thought I would use this as an opportunity. So that's the pointer? Okay. And which way goes forward? There we go. Calming, another pun, the Rangeland conflict. I think the Malpai Borderlands group, not alone, but I think they've done as much as any group in the United States to calm the great Rangeland conflict battles that raged, especially in the 1990s. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly to give you a sense of the kind of things that they've done and why it was successful in calming the Rangeland conflict. And I think it does have to do a great deal with their adaptive landscape scale approach and their collaboration. In my estimation, the Rangeland conflict, which I date to the late 1940s, but that's another story, rests in large part on two things. A structural anachronism in the laws and policies undergirding the Western Range land system, specifically the policies related to the leasing of federal lands to individual ranchers. And an intellectual anachronism in public perceptions and ideas about how Western rangelands function. And that particularly is associated with the ideas of Frederick Clements and successional theory. Malpai's working wilderness model, it's the title of photographs taken by this man, Jay Dussard, the title of the book I wrote about the Malpai group, the title of a video about the Malpai group. We all use this same phrase. And this working wilderness model, I think, addresses both of those anachronisms. The structural one through questions of land tenure, and the intellectual one through a variety of scientific research and collaboration with scientists. For those of you who don't know where Malpai is, it's right on the border with Mexico and right on the border between Arizona and New Mexico. It's about 800,000 acres in size. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. It sits right about here, so you can see it's in between the Sonoran Desert and the Chihuahuan Desert. It's also right on that cusp between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Madre. Highly biodiverse as a result of that location. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Like much of the interior West, it's got a patchwork of state, federal, and private ownership, which is a big part of what makes collaboration so essential to effectively managing the landscape at this kind of scale. Here's a picture of the people who formed the Malpai group taken in the 1990s. They founded in 1994 as a 501c3. Founded with very, very strong local participation and support, both from landowners and also from the Nature Conservancy and a nonprofit called the Animus Foundation. And it was founded at an auspicious time. The land values in the area were low enough at that time that purchasing development rights on private land was relatively affordable compared to much of, say, southern Arizona in general. I am unable to get the screen to show me the rest of my notes at the bottom of this. I will carry on. One very influential man you may not have heard of in this connection, Jim Corbett. He was friends with some of the folks in the area, didn't himself live in the area, but lived fairly nearby. And he moderated a series of conversations among the ranchers over a period of 2 years, resulting in a document they called the Malpai Agenda, named after the ranch where they met. He was a philosopher, librarian, Quaker, goat walker. A super interesting guy. And he got them to really dig down deep in the kind of facilitated discussion kind of way and reach consensus around a document. And this was one of the things they said in that document. They committed themselves to the health and unreduced diversity of the native biotic community. And that kind of statement coming from a group of ranchers at that time was fairly unusual. It struck many environmentalists as quite odd. The environmentalists felt like that was their moral high ground, right? And the ranchers were saying, sure, yep, you just don't think we can do it and we think we can. And this document and the consensus formed around it was a very strong foundation for what happened next. What were they concerned about? They were concerned in part about the loss of grasslands to shrub encroachment. We've seen some of that earlier. These identical photographs. You see all of these mesquite trees and shrubs not present here. Also, a great deal more cottonwood canopy forest in recent times. That's another story. They wanted to see fire brought back into the landscape to contend with this. They were also scared of this. They had seen this happen all over southern Arizona and much of New Mexico as well, and they didn't want it to happen where they were. The fire problem is an old one. I personally think that this report has a great deal to do with why range science spent much of the 20th century trying to avoid the issue of fire. Earl Clapp was a forester. He was also in charge of research for the Forest Service, and he put these words in this report, which interestingly was published by the American Tree Association, basically saying you can do research on rangeland problems for sure, but it will always be subordinate to producing timber, and for that reason it will always be subordinate to fire. Malpai has managed to have a lot of fires, the vast majority of them on the Gray Ranch, which there are reasons why it's a lot easier to have fires on the Gray Ranch than elsewhere. But they have had some of the largest prescribed fires, successful prescribed fires on Forest Service land. They've had fires that cross the state line between Arizona and New Mexico, which is bureaucratically tricky to do. The intellectual anachronism, another structural anachronism. This was written into all of the laws regulating the administration of federal rangelands in the West, that there would not be a higher value for these lands than grazing, and therefore if we institutionalize grazing and give people secure access to their allotments, they will manage the land to preserve that resource. This is clearly not true anymore. What Malpai has done is put easements on their private land, and they now have easements on nearly 70% of the private land in the area, and nearly 60% of the land. These polygons include both private and public leased land, just for simplicity. So they have got easements on more than 300,000 acres of private land, most of it the Nature Conservancy's easement on the Gray Ranch. Their easements are a very interesting kind of easement. They violate the IRS in perpetuity clause. They contain a clause that says if you lose your grazing privileges on the public lands that are attached to your easement, you can come to us and we will talk about whether to just get rid of your easement. It's a negotiable matter. So their easements legally look like this. Malpai has an easement on the private land, the rancher has a lease with the public land, no formal legal connection there. But because of this mutual consent clause, it potentially gives a certain kind of leverage over the agencies. You take away our grazing privileges, you might just have a development on your right next door, right? And this clause, in effect, creates a linkage there. And we did a bunch of interviews with agency people, and they unanimously agreed. They were not scared of this contingency. They said, if we have problems with management grazing on our allotment, we'll just go to the Malpai group and work with them, and we'll get it figured out. It's actually a kind of two-way leverage. Sorry, I'm going quickly. Here's the intellectual anachronism. I love the way this sentence sets up that article. Here's the man himself, Mr. Clements, on the Santa Rita Experimental Range. Here's his model, in which your stocking rate becomes the key variable driving, according to the theory, the kind of vegetation community you will find out there. I'm going to talk a little bit in a talk tomorrow about the politics that grew up around the decision to embrace Clementsian theory and range. 30, 40 years of battles and debates within and between federal agencies and scientists about how you measure this thing called carrying capacity or grazing capacity, and the sort of ongoing struggle to find a more and more and more precise way of doing it. The point here is that the model they came up with was, I've shown this many times before, here's rainfall and forage production over a period of years. This is average rainfall, average forage production, and they're saying this is how you should stock. And therefore you'll be fine in these wet years and we'll make do in these bad years, right? And that imposition of a static rate is reflective of the fact that the theory told us this was what mattered. And all of our debates between environmentalists and ranchers and agencies focused around this one question: how many cows are you going to let me have on my permit? Are you going to cut me or not cut me? And that was the focus. And I think a large part of what Malpai has successfully done is pointed out that, in fact, it's the rainfall that matters. And the stocking rate is not the only thing driving this system. Fire, or the absence of fire, is driving this system. The threat of subdivision is driving this system. Interestingly, we also found out, talking to the ranchers who did easements, that many of them decreased their stocking rates following the imposition of their easement. Some because they could afford it. They got out from under some debt with the money they got for the easement. Some because they took their cows off for a period of years and put them on the gray ranch and discovered how much benefit that could have for their rangelands. And they stopped stocking as heavily. They learned a lot from the experience of destocking their ranches for 3 to 5 years. And we did a series of interviews. Lynn Hunsinger, who's here, helped out with these, about that learning process. And it was really quite remarkable the way that they responded to watching what happened. How much time have I got? 5 minutes? So that's one example of how this process has played out on the Malpai. I want to talk specifically about collaborating with scientists. You can see in the Malpai case, and I think this is also present in a more broad discussion of these issues, the contrast between a much more experimental approach to science, which scientists tend to favor, and a more collaborative or model-based approach that may not meet the high standards of sort of methodological and statistical rigor that scientists prefer, but which may also have some advantages. And Malpai has done a little bit of both. They conducted a 10-year experiment of grazing and fire and the exclusion of grazing and the exclusion of fire on a pasture on the Gray Ranch with 4 replicates in these 4 different quadrants of the pasture, grazed and burned, grazed and unburned, ungrazed and unburned, that sort of thing. Over 10 years, they also took a lot of data about not only vegetation, but also insects and herps and mammals. And they came up with information like this, clearly suggesting that, if anything, the grazed and unburned was outperforming the ungrazed and unburned, or ungrazed and burned. And moreover, that the real huge changes occurred from year to year across all of those treatments, independently of, well, basically as a reflection of rainfall. Before and after burns, they monitored vegetation, found things like this. Basically, it's the drought that's driving the prevalence of the vegetation, or the density of the vegetation, and the fact that the unburned came out above the burned here, but not over here. There's a sort of inconsistent relationship. It can be very complicated, right? A lot of this. Basically, the more data they collected, the more they were monitoring the rainfall, regardless of how many cows or any cows or burned or unburned. It was basically a system being driven by the climate. It wasn't a system being driven by the stocking rate decisions of the individual ranchers. So those were all strengths. On the other hand, it's very expensive to maintain long-term, controlled, replicated scientific experiments. In many cases, the ranchers sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, well, tell me something I didn't already know. How is this supposed to inform my management? Is this, like, is McKinney Flats on the Gray Ranch really representative of my ranch? The Gray Ranch is higher, it's got more rainfall, it's got some of the best grasslands anywhere in the Southwest. What am I supposed to do on my, mesquite-infested or creosote flat areas? The authoritative value of the McKinney Flats experiment, great, but it doesn't mean the agencies are suddenly just going to change their minds just because you've got a paper or two. So there was also a need to engage in something which I think is actually the focus now much more, a more collaborative, model-based approach, working with people like Brandon and the Hornada, and ecological site descriptions and state and transition models, and beginning to map the ranches, in this case the Sycamore Ranch, with that framework. And you can see it's not a simple framework. There are a lot of different ecological sites to consider. you can't read it from here, but these are my notes interviewing the rancher about what's been done in that site over the last 100 years. Management decisions, things they've witnessed, changes in vegetation, to try to bring that historical and local knowledge into the analysis. So just to conclude, I don't think there is a simple recipe for effective calming. There's no sort of guidebook answer to it. I think you can identify conditions that favor or disfavor it. And the Malpai case is one in which there have been lots of conditions that have been really favorable to it. One is the Animas Range, the Gray Ranch itself. 320,000 acres, entirely private land, including an entire mountain range. You've got a lot more management discretion because you don't have federal land ownership in it. That mountain range is the closest thing to a mountain range with a natural fire regime history over the 20th century of any place in the southwestern U.S. You have to go to Mexico to find others. You've got extraordinary biodiversity. You've got the strong interest of the Nature Conservancy and the environmental community and scientists because of that biodiversity. You have some extraordinarily charismatic and talented individuals, including wealthy ones like Drum Hadley, who has got connections and resources. People like Warner Glenn, who basically makes people feel like they're in a Western movie, and they fall all over for his charisma. People like Bill McDonald, extraordinary diplomat, extraordinarily skilled at communicating with people. And this mixture of skills and attributes, I think, has also been a big part of their success. You've also got canny PR and good luck. Warner Glenn ran into this animal when he was hunting mountain lions. When was it? 1997, I think. His dogs managed to sort of tree this animal and then pin it out there on that rock outcropping, and Warner took a bunch of pictures and went back home and talked to his wife and talked to the Malpai group, and they decided, we're not going to cover this up, we're going to go public with it big. And it ended up in the New York Times. First live jaguar ever photographed in the southwestern United States. All the previous ones had been killed first and then photographed. And that had ended in like the 40s, right? And this really sort of said, we're not hiding anything. In fact, we want to brag about the fact that we have habitat for this animal and that we support its coming back. Things like that, that kind of courage and that kind of luck have also contributed a great deal. And I think with that, yeah, that's it. Thank you.